Welcome to the final thoughts on unlocking the dream vision and the Exodus beyond. I am your host, author R.J. von-Bruening. In these last few videos, we'll be exploring the rest of the story that brings this ancient esoteric knowledge into our own modern world, as explored in my books, Unlocking the Dream Vision, The Secret History of Creation, and the Exodus and Beyond. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to hit the like button below and subscribe for future videos. This series presents information based in part upon theory and conjecture of the system of esoteric symbolism. The purpose is to suggest some possible interpretation, but not necessarily the only one to the many mysteries we will explore. We have now reached the point where we can begin leaving the mystical symbolism of the dream vision and the esoteric knowledge that it holds behind and begin entering into the world of modern knowledge. Unlike the mystical symbolism that we've been exploring, much of what follows is surprisingly straightforward. It's also because it's easy to understand with our new knowledge of the esoteric symbolism and its secret history of creation, and the mystical and animal symbolism of the dream vision that tells the story of creation. This leg of the journey begins soon after the impact and destruction of the great heaven and the events leading up to the great and final battle, the judgment and the great transformation, all occurring around 10,775 BC. It is at this point of the story where the Younger Dryas, or the Big Freeze, begins to unleash its unrelenting cold, ice, and drought upon the world for the next approximately 1,300 years. This was the beginning of a dark and troubled time of death that brought extinction to at least 40 different large prehistoric animals and dozens of different animal species. As we've learned, the remnant that was saved and the survivors of the final battle with the help of the gods go underground and live while they wait out the climatic changes in the many different underground cities and areas that we've found all around the world. Something that does not appear to cross anyone's mind is the fact that there would be many people that were not involved in the actual fighting, nor were they saved or killed by all the terrible events that unfolded. These were the people who just lived simple lives. They were far from any of the dramatic events that occurred, and for many of them, they would have been totally unaware that anything had happened until the weather began to change and the animals and plants began to die off. As you can imagine, for these people, after the fighting was over and the gods had gone away and saved the remnant, society as a whole just basically started to collapse across the board as the population collapsed. Given the additional factor that the support and guidance of the gods had also vanished, the entire support network and the primary reason and purpose for the civilization had also vanished with them. Outside of a few city-states here and there, it appears that the rest of humanity began entering a great dark age, with almost all of the surviving people returning to a much more primitive form of existence, a Neolithic-like form of society. A society where very little, if anything, was remembered, as the needs for day-to-day survival became the overwhelming important factor in these people's lives. After roughly 1,000 years of cold and ice, starting at approximately 9,500 BC, the Younger Dryas era begins to come towards an end. The ice stops advancing, and the rains begin returning, and the climate in general begins stabilizing and starting to warm up. It is around this time period that we see the incredibly mysterious ancient site of Göbekli Tepe come into existence, and I probably destroyed the way you pronounce that. For those who are not familiar with Göbekli Tepe, it is an archaeological site located in southeastern Turkey. It was at this site where circles of massive T-shaped stone pillars were discovered. There are more than 200 known pillars on approximately 20 different stone circles currently known throughout the site. Typically, each pillar has a height of about 20 feet or 6 meters and weighing in at estimated 20 tons. They are also fitted into sockets that were dug directly into the bedrock. Now there appears to be a second phase of building, and in this phase of building the pillars were normally smaller in size and stood in rectangular rooms that were made out of polished lime. All the pillars have numerous animal symbolism carved into them. One of the biggest mysteries about this site is the fact that around 9000 BC, the entire site appears to have been purposely buried by its inhabitants and then abandoned, where it sat forgotten for almost 11,000 years until its discovery just a few decades ago in the late 20th century. The secret that is needed for understanding this mysterious ancient archaeological site is recognizing that the huge amount of animal symbolism on the stone pillars is the key. This animal symbolism is the exact same animal symbolism that we've been exploring throughout the dream vision and is seen on the ancient artifacts. Once we realize this connection to the mystical animal symbolism, we can begin to start piecing this great mystery and its story back together. We can now easily imagine that once the ice had stopped advancing and the climate began stabilizing, the Lord God faction began trying to reestablish a new society at this site, with the first modern humans created by the Great Transformation. I suspect that once all the pillars are uncovered at this site, which now appears will never happen, we will have a complete version of the entire symbolic dream vision as told through the mystical animal symbolism. I also suspect that we'll find that the site is set up much like a modern-day Christian church or a Catholic church, where the layout of the church building and the symbolism within it reflect the 12 stations of the cross and the overall story of the Passion of Christ as told in the Bible. This allows us to realize that the entire site is likely set up in such a way that through a process of an unknown ritual and ceremony, you would be told the hidden meaning and story of all the animal symbolism on the pillars, which would be very similar and likely a complete version of the secret history of creation that we've been exploring. This then allows us to realize that it appears that the Lord God faction was trying to reestablish the same slave society as from before, in the hope that our ancestors would view and worship them as gods once again. Based on what we now know, I think it's reasonable to think that they were rather unsuccessful, and then after a few hundred years they buried and abandoned the site. Very shortly we'll take a closer look at this possible aspect, but we must first look at the more likely reason of why they would have abandoned the site in the first place when the vast ice sheets began to melt. According to modern science, it appears that the Göbekli Tepe site was buried and then abandoned at roughly the same time that the great ice sheets that had grown in advance during the Younger Dryas period began to melt. As you are most likely already aware, the melting of the great ice sheets of the last great ice age and the Younger Dryas would have had a huge impact on the entire world, with one of the most dramatics being that the water levels of the ocean was raised by an estimated 400 feet or 120 meters, very close to the present day levels. This massive rise in sea level would have also drastically changed the climate the world over, more or less creating the world that we see today. Additionally, as the great ice sheets retreated, it radically changed the weather patterns of the entire world. This began the long, slow process of turning once lush, wet, and green areas into vast deserts, while at the same time turning once hot desert-like areas into lush forests with large amounts of animal life. While in still other areas, great forests disappeared and became great grasslands and plains, while in others they became jungles. What is important to understand about this massive climate change from the ice melting and the even more radical change in the ocean levels was that it basically cut the Lord God faction off from the rest of the world. If this interpretation we've been exploring is correct, and the New Jerusalem is actually located somewhere on the Antarctic landmass, then we can easily imagine that the gods would have had more pressing problems in trying to reestablish their old way of life, with the most important being the fact that all around the world the ice was melting. Within Antarctica, the opposite happened. The ice didn't melt, it began to advance. This was because the warm ocean currents that once brought heat to Antarctica radically changed course as the massive amounts of fresh water was injected into the oceans from the melting ice. This massive influx of fresh water shifted the warm ocean currents from the south to the north into the patterns we now know today. This change in ocean currents would have had the effect of turning Antarctica into the frozen wasteland it is today. Realizing this, and common sense tells us that the gods would have either had to abandon the site or move it underground as the ice advanced. If we take our new knowledge of the secret esoteric history of creation and combine it with all the odd reports over the years and the strange mysterious things supposedly happening at the bottom of the world, we can reasonably think that the Lord God faction didn't really have a choice, but they had to move underground to avoid the advancing ice. Given the site of this New Jerusalem as described in the Bible as we explored before, it is easy to understand that moving such a large complex underground would have been a daunting and time-consuming task to accomplish. In addition, as the sea levels began to rise, and if this New Jerusalem was located in a relatively low spot, then flooding could have also been a major concern, adding to additional engineering problems. These practical problems combined with the incredible climate change going on at the time would have just basically cut them off from the rest of the world. In addition, we have a large body of ancient myth, legend, and folklore of when and how the many different peoples of the world slowly began re-emerging and from living underground for hundreds of years after the fiery destruction of the heaven and the coming of the ice. The more familiar and famous of these ancient stories come from many of the native tribes of the America, with the Hopi tribe of northern Arizona being one of the most popular and widely known versions of this story. As many are already aware, in the Hopi story it is said that after the great destruction of the last world, the Hopi people lived underground for an unknown amount of time in an area in or around the Grand Canyon in northern Arizona, and with the aid of numerous servants of the gods. These servants of the gods were typically described as insect-like humanoids that were sometimes referred to as the ant people. Many have remarked that the traditional Hopi description of these ant people are very similar to modern-day descriptions of what is popularly known as the Greys within the UFO lore. With the common idea that these alien creatures may have had thinly built bodies with large heads, with black almond-shaped eyes with gray skin. It's very easy to imagine how somebody would think that the typical gray alien of today's modern pop culture and UFO lore could easily be thought of as the same type of insect-like people that the Hopi refer to. The Hopi story then goes on to tell us that after a long amount of time of living underground with the servants of the gods, many of the people began to become restless and long to return to the surface. In the few known versions of this story in English, it is at this point in time that some type of conflict breaks out among the people. This conflict develops to the point where the people break into two groups, with one group wishing to leave and the other wishing to stay with the servants of the gods. It is at this point in time that the servants of the gods intervene and allow the ones who wish to leave to return to the surface. It is these people that left the safety of the underground shelters that the Hopi say that their own people and the tribes of today are descended from. This story of the Hopi is very similar to other ones that are found all around the world. In all these ancient stories, at some unknown point in time, after the ice had melted and the stars had moved, the many different people of the worlds began to leave the safety of these underground shelters and return to the surface and start life once again. Within a surprisingly large number of these ancient myths from all around the world, we are told that soon after the people had left the safety of these underground shelters, there was the coming of a great godlike bearded white man who arrived from the sea during this time of troubles and new settlement. Some of the best known stories of this mysterious individual come from the Mesoamerican cultures that were recorded by the Spanish conquistadors in the 16th century. The best known of these ancient myths about this mysterious bearded individual is the Inca creator and civilizing deity known as Viracocha. Although the Inca called him Viracocha, this mysterious individual was known by several different names by many different cultures throughout the Americas. What is truly remarkable is that all the known cultures and myths of Mesoamerica, Viracocha is always remembered and described in exactly the same way. He is normally remembered as the creator of all things, but not in the sense that he created the world in the monotheistic idea of God, or in Genesis. In the Mesoamerican traditions, he is viewed as the creator of civilization, which was the substance and purpose for which all other things were created. He was also intimately associated with the seas, the sun, and the mighty storm. Symbolically, he is commonly shown as wearing the sun as a crown with twin thunderbolts in his hands, with tears descending from his eyes representing the rains and the mighty life-giving waters. There's also been much misunderstanding and misinterpretation of the accounts of Viracocha and his physical appearances. This is most commonly due to the many different Christian sects trying to tie Viracocha into their idea of Jesus Christ or a Christian-like saint or prophet. Although many of these ideas are very creative, the truth is that the Spanish chronicles from the 16th century is the only source of information we really have on Viracocha and these myths. In the accounts dating from approximately 1553, we are told that the conquistadors were greeted as gods and called Viracochas because of their lighter skin and of their beards, because they looked similar to their god Viracocha. In other similar accounts, we learn that the Viracocha was remembered as a great bearded white man with striking blue eyes that had a great godlike power and knowledge who came from the sea. In many of these different accounts recorded by the Spanish chronicles, we are told the same basic story. That this mysterious Viracocha arrived sometime after the ice had melted and the ocean levels had risen, which would have placed his arrival around 7000 to 8000 BC. He is commonly described as an elderly, gray-haired, bearded, grandfatherly-like man in a long flowing white cloak wearing sandals. And he always had these striking crystal blue eyes and the power of a god who came from the sea, typically on a great serpent or a mat of serpents. In many of these accounts, his appearance seems to be much like Saint Bartholomew, as painters had represented him over the years, especially during the Middle Ages. In these accounts, we are told that after Viracocha arrives, he finds the people living like animals and very little to no trace of civilization being left. After arriving from the sea, he then spends much of his time educating the people about civilization, bringing them farming, building, and most importantly, how to properly worship the deity. What is truly remarkable about these accounts is the fact that Viracocha is never automatically viewed as a god by these people. He is instead normally viewed as a great and powerful man who possesses great godlike power and knowledge. What makes this so important is that it shows us that the great transformation not only physically changed us, but it also caused us to lose the unique trait that made our ancient ancestors think of these beings as gods and their technology as divine magic. As we just learned about the Göbekli Tepe site, it appears that the Lord God faction may have been making another attempt to try to reestablish their old way of life. But the grand transformation had been a little too successful, because in all these accounts we were told that after Viracocha had brought civilization to the people, he then left the same way he came, on a great serpent from the sea. He's also always remembered to have saying that one day he would return, but as far as we know, he never has. With our new knowledge of the secret esoteric history of creation that we have unlocked within the mystical symbolism of the dream vision, we can now begin to figure out and understand just who this mysterious Viracocha may have been. As you have most likely already figured it out, it is highly probable that this Viracocha is in fact the leader of the Lord God faction and is going around the world trying to reestablish their power. The great serpent that he is typically described as having or riding would of course be the legendary monster remembered in the biblical tradition as Leviathan and that we saw on the earlier stelas. Although our understanding of the secret history of creation can help answer the question about who Viracocha possibly was, it cannot answer the many questions surrounding what exactly he was trying to do and why he left, seemingly never to return. We can speculate that the grand transformation may have worked a little too well, and we just no longer viewed him or any of the people as gods or the messengers of the gods, as in the same way our ancient Cro-Magnon man ancestors had. After this mysterious Viracocha had left, the story goes silent for the next few thousand years, with it appearing that if there was any contact between us and them, it was not recorded or it was forgotten. In our next video, we'll explore this almost forgotten time between the leaving of Viracocha and the coming of the mysterious Comanche masters of the early Middle Ages. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button below and don't forget to subscribe for future videos.